PETSCII Robots has become one of my favorite games to play on the Commodore 64. It works so well with the Super NES controller, I wanted to have the same experience on the C64. It's not officially supported, but I'm going to show you how you can use a USB Super NES style controller on the C64 to play PETSCII Robots in the same way. I make it a point to buy new software for old computers at least annually. One particular game that I rather enjoy is called PETSCII Robots by the 8-bit guy, Mr. David Murray himself. In short, this is a blast to play on the Commodore 64 or VIC-20. Probably the best action puzzle-style game built for either platform. There is so much to it, and because it is so good, it has been ported to many other platforms, including the Sega Genesis, Commodore Amiga, the Commodore 128. There's an upgraded Commodore 64 version that requires a RAM expansion unit, the Commander X16, Commodore Plus 4, Apple II, Atari 800 line, Sony PlayStation Portable, Sinclair Spectrum. I very much enjoy my experience on the actual hardware, the Commodore 64 or VIC-20, but I wanted to play the game on the newer TheC64, this reimplementation of a Commodore 64, but using modern hardware with USB interfaces and HDMI audio output and a micro USB for power. So it's nice to have in the living room. It's a little more kid friendly than real hardware, and I don't have to be quite as nervous about them, messing something up, sticking something where they shouldn't. Just a little bit better for the living room, let's just say. Unfortunately, using the Super NES style controller on the C64 wasn't as straightforward as one might think. It's not actually supported, but I wanted to be able to play using the Super NES controller, like a USB one plugged in, playing the game instead of the keyboard, because I think the controller is a much more enjoyable experience than the keyboard for playing this style of game. It took me a lot of digging on the internet to find a solution to this particular issue I was having, using a Super NES controller to play PETSCII Robots on the C64. Since I had the larger variant, not the mini, I could have very easily just stuck with the keyboard and it would have been fine, but I very much enjoyed the experience of playing it on real hardware with the super cool user port to SNES adapter that came included in my box set of PETSCII Robots for my Commodore 64. This USB-style Super NES-like controller I use for retro gaming on my Linux machines does work on the C64, but not in such a way that I could, by default, use it to play the game as intended by the author. The C64 has all sorts of fantastic ways to set custom configurations to applications or games through passing information in the file name on the disk image itself or through a configuration file called a CJM. I read the manual quite extensively and understood conceptually how it worked, but I didn't have a way to know how the Super NES-like controller was mapped with this configuration file. It was very clear how to use the joystick. That was all very well laid out, but other controllers, not so much. I did find a solution on this page, gigabytestech.com, which does work, but not fully as I would like. Looking at the solution, which I can confirm works, as stated, still left me a little scratching my head. Why was I seeing repeats of some buttons? Why are there multiple Z and M entries and so forth? I wanted to really understand what the configuration file was doing and maybe perhaps tweak it just a little bit. I still didn't know which buttons were represented in the file to the Super NES-like controller. I really had to take all the information I found, experiment with it, and dumb it down to my lower level of understanding. I needed to understand how to define the CJM file for PETSCII Robots. Using my favorite text editor, Kate, I created a file that contained but one line of information as per the solution on gigabytestech.com. To my surprise, it worked as expected, but then I wondered, how could a PlayStation-like controller, this Logitech DualShock controller, take advantage of the additional buttons? But I still was not left clearly knowing the locations of buttons defined by the joystick configuration parameters. It took some more time digging, but after a lot of reading and experimentation, I've been able to figure out what each value corresponds with for a joystick or gamepad. I was able to further understand more of the CJM controller puzzle. And since my little monkey brain can't hold and modify information in a table in my head, I built a matrix. This matrix makes it very clear for me to look and see what each value separated by commas does in the CJM file. I also put in there the configuration I'm using for PETSCII Robots, and I could make some other modifications too, but I just left it as it is for, well, reasons. For the sake of time retention on this video, I'm not going to explain what each section does, but if you look at the matrix, it will start to make sense to you. And I did add the F1 and F3 function keys for cycling weapons and items respectively for the PlayStation-like controller, or two-stick controller, or whatever you want to call it. So this is the one area where my configuration file differs from the article on gigabytestech.com. This will allow me those additional functions where I don't actually have to touch the keyboard at all to play the game, which I think is pretty exciting. Now, just some really quick notes. You have to ensure that the CJM file name matches the disk image name exactly. So C64robots.D64 needs to have a C64robots.CJM. Otherwise, the C64 will not load those configurations. I wanted to be able to play the VIC-20 version of this game on the C64 as well. So I created another file that tells the C64 to go into VIC-20 mode and to apply all those settings as well. Also, specifically telling it that it's in joystick port 1 because there's only one joystick port on a VIC-20. I have a link to the download to set it up the easy way. Just take the CJM files, put them in the same folder on the C64, the USB drive you use for that, and you can enjoy PETSCII Robots on some slightly more modern-ish hardware. Now, just a quick note, you must ensure that when you do play PETSCII Robots, that you leave the controls on keyboard, because the gamepad is essentially invoking keyboard commands to PETSCII Robots. But that does mean that you can go back and forth from using the keyboard to the controller, so it's, kind of like a bonus. Although I generally prefer to play my old games on original hardware, or in this case, a new game built for old hardware, I find PETSCII Robots to be one of those games I need to be able to invest a lot more time into. I need more time for exploration, so the ability to save state and come back to it is very valuable to me. I don't have any way to do that on my genuine hardware yet. The C64 doesn't come equipped with a user port for the SNES controller adapter, so to get that same Commodore 64 fun, it was necessary to set up a SNES or PlayStation-style USB controller for the C64, and I am extremely happy with the results. If you would like to give PETSCII Robots a try, there are some shareware downloads. You can download the shareware version for the Commodore PET, Commodore 64, there's a RAM expansion unit version of it as well, the Commander X16, the Commodore 128, Amiga, and Sega Genesis as well. Thanks for watching.